Why is Donald Trump so interested in rare earth minerals? The US president has struck a number of deals in his tour of Asia this week, while China keeps a tight grip on the metals. So what can Trump do to break Beijing's restrictions? And why do rare earths matter so much? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Since coming back to the White House earlier this year, Donald Trump has made securing access to rare earth minerals one of his top priorities. In March, Trump went as far as signing an executive order where he invoked wartime powers to increase the production of rare earths. And this week he signed several agreements with a number of Asian countries in the hopes of gaining access to the minerals. This is all to counter China's global dominance in this sector and Beijing's recent restrictions on rare earth exports. So why are these minerals so crucial for the US economy? And can Trump break China's monopoly? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first this report from Alex Baird.
Rare earth metals are found in just about every part of modern life. From cars and television screens to phones, medical equipment, weapons and clean energy transition, they are essential to nearly every industry worldwide. But that has made them the latest flashpoint for geopolitical tensions. US President Donald Trump is now touring Asia as he seeks to shore up his country's access to the 17 metals. He's now signed deals with Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam and Cambodia.
In about a year from now, we'll have so much critical mineral and rare earths that you won't know what to do with them. They'll be worth about $2.
Trump's tariff war, particularly with China, has been focused on securing better access to the metals and at better prices.
I don't want them to play the rare earth game with us.
But in April, after the US slapped Beijing with 54% tariffs, China began to restrict exports of 7 rare earths. Many of the shipments have since resumed, but it's exposed how fragile the trade is. And that's because China is a giant on the rare earth stage. It holds nearly half of the world's reserves, much bigger than the next two largest, Brazil and India. Australia, Russia, Vietnam, the US and the Danish territory of Greenland also lead the world in reserves but are still small in comparison. But China is also a giant in how much it produces, handling up to 90% of the global processing, once again dominating the rest of the world and making the world reliant on China. With much modern technology involving rare earth metals in some way, the environmental toll has also been high. Mining the metals requires the use of heavy chemicals and solvents that result in toxic waste that has caused significant damage, particularly in China and Myanmar. The need for rare earths is continuing to grow significantly, with projections demand could increase by up to 60% in the next 15 years. And as their importance grows, so too will their ability to be a focal point for conflict on the global stage. Alex Baird, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guest. In Hong Kong is Brian Wong, an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Hong Kong. In Washington, D.C., Gracelin Baskaran, mining economist and director of the Critical Mineral Security Program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. And in Paris, Henry Huiyao Wang, founder of the Centre for China and Globalization. A very warm welcome to each of you. Brian, first to you in Hong Kong. Why is who controls the supply of rare earths so important?
Well, thank you very much. It's worth noting that rare earths are incorporated and utilized in a vast range of products ranging from consumer electronics such as smartphones and TVs to clean energy products such as wind turbines and electric vehicles, which are very much likely to, in many ways, drive the renewable transition, especially if we accept as a majority of countries do, that climate change is indeed an impending and serious risk that countries and governments around the world have to take seriously. So rare earths are obviously incredibly vital for the modern, or shall we say, the postmodern age, and also, of course, economic processes within it. But more specifically, in the context of trade wars and negotiations, it's worth noting that as it stands, China dominates approximately 70% of the rare earth mining processes and controls up to 90% of the production facilities of rare earths. And that has obviously meant that it's gained an outsized leverage against not just America, but also all other countries when it comes to strategic negotiations. And yet, frankly, we look more substantively at China's track record with regards to instrumentalizing rare earths. It's only really been Japan in the early 2010s and also the US that it's pulled out all the stops really in signaling explicitly its desire to use rare earths as a bargaining chip. Why has that been the case, and to what extent will this continue? That much remains to be seen. But my prediction here is that from this moment onwards, really, and from 2025 onwards, this year would be written in the history books as a year that changed in many ways how folks conceptualize energy supply chains and also manufacturing supply chains in the world, where critical stockpiling of rare earths is no longer optional, but is now a necessity for powers, no matter the size and also scale and also their political allegiance.
So, Gracelin, with that comprehensive Rare Earths 101 from Brian there, why is Donald Trump then so keen on doing these deals around rare earths?
Yeah, to add to Brian's great points, I think I would add two things. The first is that critical minerals are also deeply the bedrock of national security. When you come to rare earths, you cannot produce virtually any form of defense technology, whether a fighter jet, a warship, a missile, a tank, a laser, a satellite, a drone, without those rare earths. So at a time when China is rapidly outpacing the US with manufacturing and acquiring weapons, I have a colleague at CSIS who notes that China is acquiring weapons at a rate of 5 to 6x the United States, and argues actually that our industrial base lacks the surge capabilities that we need if there was kinetic conflict. In that instance, we're going to need these rare earths to build these capabilities if we were to enter war. That would be one. The second thing I would say is the United States does not enjoy being held hostage at the negotiating table over rare earths. And because we need these rare earths, as Brian noted, for every part of our modern economy, in addition to national security, we have to have access to them. So for as long as an adversary holds the monopoly card, the trump card here, if we will, then we continue, as we've seen now entering our third round of negotiations this year, to restore access, which isn't a great position from a sovereignty angle.
So, Henry, Brian and Gracelin, they're not shy in emphasising how important rare earths are. Why is who controls it, is access so important in your opinion?
Well, I think that, China is basically, has said many times, it's, if the semiconductor chips that U.S. has dual use as restrictions, because precisely as just our previous guest said, because rare earths can be used in weaponry, in war machines, in all those fighting mechanisms. It's important that we do not really expand this war, and we should control that. And as the U.S. did the same. It was actually U.S. invented this kind of decoupling the risk and this kind of a separation process. But China's position of this rare earths is hard earned. It's not out of the blue. Of course, China was naturally empowered with these abundant resources, almost 40% of the reserves, 70% of 80% of the mining easily to mine compared with other countries. But 90% of this processing capacity is not falling out of the sky. It was really during the hard years of build-up, environmental pollutions, and harness this smelting and separation process. It's a hard technology that China earned over the years, where other countries abandoned that, like U.S. Get rid of this dirty and non-productive and not very promising business. So China, did that. So The world is basically, we should be, in a perfect world, we are really helping each other. We should really support each other, and also it's really abundant supply everywhere. But, U.S. started this kind of a trade war, tariff war, and decoupling the risk and thousands of Chinese companies on the sanction list. China took 8 years to learn from U.S. It's only starting now to have this dual-use control. So I think, we have to really reflect the roots of the problem rather than just blaming China for that.
Okay, and so just building there, Brian, on what Henry is saying, how did China end up controlling 90% of the rare earths market? Once upon a time, France was a big producer of rare earths. The United States, as Henry touched on, was a producer. What went wrong, if you like, from the perspective of those countries now relying on China?
Well, I think, it's worth noting that the 1980s and the 90s were really when China started investing heavily and substantively into rare earth processing. And I think much of that actually came from Deng Xiaoping, the chief architect of that very process himself, who spotted and noted the strategic importance and vitality of rare earths. And he's repeatedly instructed, in the 80s, of course, subordinates and technocrats in the system to explore the means by which safe, or at the very least efficient and broadly safe extractions possible. But there are three elements that's worth noting very quickly. The first is, of course, economies of scale, the immense scale that we've seen producing the kind of advanced cutting edge robotics, super cheap and also high quality electric vehicles. That's also really been a winning recipe when it comes to rare earth in China. Secondly, laxer environmental regulations spurred by provincial and local officials' incentives to one-up one another, of course, in meeting key performance indicators. That has helped, crack a lot of the red tape and also bureaucratic inefficiency that characterize other top-down state-planned systems. China is not top-down state-planned exclusively. That's the beauty here, where if you note the agency of mid-ranking bureaucrats and also provincial and municipal officials, these were instrumental, right? These folks were instrumental in seeing through the cutting of corners, for the better or worse, when it comes to the extracting and processing of rare earths. And finally, STEM graduates. China today produces on average 6.3 to 7 million STEM graduates each year. I mean, that's a pretty astounding number if you think about it, as compared with the US, which produces approximately a half or a third, depending on the exact survey you're looking at there. And when you therefore put these numbers in perspective, it is no surprise that China has managed to accomplish such a remarkable lead in processing that is going to be quite difficult for other countries to replicate, whether it be due to extreme overhead costs, legal barriers and hurdles, judicial review, and also other checks and balances and mechanisms that are simply not there in China per se.
All right, so Gracelin, given that lead that Brian has explained that China has built up, what are the challenges going to be in diversifying away from China for countries that want to do that?
Look, I would argue that China's perhaps overplayed its hand. And what I mean by that is you have seen a global effort. I mean, you have seen Japan, Australia, Malaysia, all of these countries work with the US, countries like Brazil, Saudi Arabia, to work to reduce that reliance at warp speed. What happened this year compared to export restrictions of other minerals in previous years were that these restrictions impacted the entire world, right? We saw Japan had to stop automotive manufacturing. European countries had to stop automotive manufacturing. So what's happened is there's become a new resolve to work together to counter that Chinese dominance. And what you've seen in a relatively amount of short a time is the power of collective action. Earlier this year, Australia-based Lynas separated heavy rare earths in Malaysia. There's a heavy rare earths deposit in Brazil that should be sending rare earths not in the not too distant future to the United States. Saudi Arabia has announced that they will be a supplier to the US with a 30-month timeline for developing heavy rare earths. So again, what we're seeing here is the power of collective action. And the challenges you have are not whether the world can reduce its reliance on China, it's how quick it can do it. Because some of these things, mining and permanent magnets, are not an overnight industry. So one is the capital. And we really are seeing, again, the US-Australia deal, which really focused on rare earths. Each announced that each country would inject $1 billion within 6 months. And this is pretty significant because remember, historically, Australian minerals minerals are highly vertically integrated with going to China for processing. You've also seen the technical know-how is starting to come together. There's been a lot of commitments from countries like Japan to work together to build that, as well as Australia. And then the third thing I would say is, how do we manage kind of the environmental challenges? Because I would agree with the previous colleague. For a lot of countries that were very happy to take what we call the not in my backyard approach, NIMBYism, is we're really working on the R&D on how do we do it cleaner and how do we do it better. You see some of these new rare earth operations outside of China use a completely closed loop water system, which is a massive saver on the amount of water in an era of climate change. So again, you see structural challenges. You also see structural kind of collective solutions, including on workforce development, where I expect to see a lot of collaboration between the US and Australia, which has quite a robust mine workforce.
Sure. All right. Well, Henry, as Gracelin suggests, has China overplayed its hand a little bit in the restrictions, export restrictions it imposed back in April, and it's suggesting they may impose in a month's time or so from now? The Chinese might say, well, it's in response to Trump's tariffs. But what do you say?
Well, I think it's the opposite. The U.S. has played too much and too overplay. For 8 years already since the first Trump term, and China just starting to rebel, maybe to really shake off this kind of sanctions and things like that. But it's okay. It's other country has the right to develop. I'm sure that's not a problem. But it just takes time. It's going to take 5 to 8 years to do the proper separation and proper processing and application of the technology and using all the things we have. And then if we all reinvent the wheel and have a different silos to do different things, that'd be fine. But the bottom line of the problem is that the U.S. should abandon its restriction first. Like on the sanction on the Chinese companies, or restrict the sales the chips to China and things like that. I'm sure, 5-8 years time, China could develop its own chips capacity as well. And 5-8 years time, other countries could develop this rare earth processing capacity. But, let's not wait 5 years, 5-8 years of that long. And let's really abandon this Cold War mentality, and you prevent me, I prevent you. And let's, work together, basically, help each other, and then have competitive advantage of each other. And let's get all the things. But one thing I can be assured of, the capacity, the synergy, the synchronizing power China has now with, most advanced transportation system, most advanced processing system, most advanced manufacturing system, and the large talent pool there, it's going to be, going to take a lead for a long time to come. So while we have to do that, China has always wants to maintain good relations with every country. But let's work together, abandon this restrictions, tariff war, trade war, and let's get back to the normal. So it's just how silly for US to think. The first time they felt, what's going on? We are being also restricted now. We're always able to restrict others, but now others cannot restrict us. For the first time, China, start to restrict as well. So I think the bottom line is we should abandon this the course of the first place, that sanction others, retaliate everybody, and that's not really good. I think we all learned a lesson from this. Let's really display a competitive advantage of every country, and let's build a better world for everyone.
All right. Well, Brian Henry is suggesting there that there shouldn't be battle lines, there should be cooperation instead. But if the US and other European countries wanted to catch up on rare earths production, are they already too far behind, as Henry suggests, with China's advances, and you hinted at earlier on as well?
Yeah, I remember speaking to a group of senior European bureaucrats and investors around 2 years ago on this very question. And there was a lot of sort of internal consternation, but also intrigue over the possibility of Europe in cultivating domestic and endogenous stockpiling capabilities. And to which I just pointed out that, you've got to understand the importance of Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Central Asia in this dynamic. that the fact of the matter is, 22% of the world's population live inside China and the US, but the remaining 78% of the world are equally, actually, if not more so important. And this is where, this is no better than epitomized, really, in a context of rare earths, where, of course, Brazil and India and Myanmar are important stakeholders. I think we haven't quite talked about today just yet, and yet they each are respectively, either important mining or processing, or both mining and processing powers that would increasingly be flexing their muscles with regards to the rare earths capacities to negotiate and bargain with both the Chinese and the Americans. And if you look at the treaties that were signed, or not treaties, sorry, the agreements that were signed between Trump and his counterparts, right? The agreements between Malaysia and the US and Thailand and the US are non-binding over the rare earths, which suggests what? It suggests that there's room and possibility for strategic maneuvering and also leveraging of these treaties, or of these agreements rather, on a part of the respective governments to press for more concessions from the US, even whilst, of course, a de-risking narrative runs strong and prevalent in relation to China. So all of these examples go to show that third-party countries and third-party regions are rising in this increasingly multiplex world, to use the words of Amitav Acharya. And of course, even in the case of Australia and Japan, their allegiance and alignment with America over rare earths, or over semiconductors in the case of Japan, should not be taken for granted, because we've seen the election, especially in Japan, of Sanae Takaichi, who's a very formidable foreign policy, thinking sort of a leader with her own vision for Japanese foreign policy that's independent from both Washington and certainly not in line with Beijing's either. So it's important to recognize the agency of powers that are not the US or China, as opposed to reducing everything to this sort of faux Cold War narrative. And I call it faux because it's not a sincere representation of what the world actually looks like today.
Gracelin, it's incredibly expensive for governments to invest in rare earth exploitation and development. The US has tried to open a plant in California that closed after 5 years because it couldn't compete. How are we going to have to accept that we might have to pay more for rare earths? How much of a risk is it for governments to compete with China's position?
So the first thing I want to point out is that rare earths are a tiny market. Like, we don't need, hundreds of thousands of tons of rare earths, like the way we would think about lithium or nickel or cobalt or some of these base metals. So from the economics, it matters that it's a small market. The second thing I would say is you have seen an unprecedented amount of effort go in this year to support what we would literally call infant industry protection. So protecting and letting a very nascent industry grow. So you saw the United States, after the April 4th export restrictions, become the largest shareholder of MP Materials. And that was a really big move, because we typically don't do state-owned enterprises, particularly as it relates to mining. We also saw the U.S. roll a price floor out that was twice the price of the current market price. So at the time, it was about $54 a kilogram. For NdPr oxide, they guaranteed $110. That's really significant. And what we've seen is when you level the playing field, right? Because obviously we have higher costs of production. Some of that is technology, but some of that is also that we're not operating on cheap coal-fired power to keep a lot of these things running. So we saw that price floor come in, and subsequently we saw companies like General Motors and Apple sign offtake agreement. We saw that when we got that amount of government capital, companies like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan came in with in tune of $1 billion to help build this industry. We've also seen the government guarantee offtake of the permanent magnets that are made using those rare earths. So what we're really doing here is leveling the playing field. It's not a secret that a lot of the Chinese monopoly was built on the back of a lot of state capital, a lot of state support through other mechanisms such as energy, and building out that ecosystem that the US and Western countries haven't generally put in. So what you're seeing is that support is really critical to leveling the playing field and ensuring that these projects, A, are long-term commercially viable, and B, that we can start to sign those offtake agreements and create supply chains that don't have that Chinese involvement.
All right. Henry, I just want to quickly ask you the motivation behind China's decision to potentially strengthen those export restrictions, demanding documentation on what vehicles, what products the rare earths are going to be used in. What was the motivation behind that, do you think?
Well, this is not started by China, obviously. I mean, as I said, 8 years ago, the U.S. started sanctions and the trade wars and everything. China was just defending itself, using the same logic that rationing that the U.S. has been using, which shows how ridiculous it is. If we're all starting to really, taking all those do-use and then really also starting to concentrate on its own, the world is probably not going to be non-productive. So I think that those tied knots should untie itself, and U.S. should really starting to really work with China and other countries. And China, I'm sure, with this summit between President Xi and President Trump, they're going to have 3 times to meet probably within a year. I'm sure now we learned the hard way that we cannot restrict each other. The world is so complicated, and China has such a strong position, not just minerals, many other actors, pharmaceutical supply, raw materials, many things. China is at the advanced stage of the world. So better, we trade each other equally, fairly, and let's really concentrate to make a better world for all us live in.
All right, Brian, quickly, we know that there are huge environmental costs at extracting some rare earth minerals. Why are we so bad at recycling? Just 1% of rare earths are recycled. Where can we build on that? How?
Well, I've got to preface this by saying that I don't have the technical expertise to comment on difficulties of recycling, but it's also worth thinking about where the money lies and where the most lucrative aspects of course, mining and processing have been thus far. The hope, of course, is that the market incentives could realign such that recycling is indeed encouraged and facilitated by cost-reducing technologies. But I presume the barriers are still quite high as it stands, and there hasn't been any strong concerted push from any individual government to see to recycling, although I do believe the Europeans are actively considering that precisely because of the challenges on their part with regards to processing in the first place, the huge overheads, the bureaucratic and legal obstacles, and of course objections from local parliamentarians and councillors as well.
Gracelin, can you quickly help us with that in a brief answer? Why are we so bad at recycling? So little is done.
Yeah, so 2 quick points there. One, I think the big thing to Henry's point earlier that I just wanted to comment on is it's really hard to talk about a peaceful tomorrow where everybody works together without mentioning Taiwan. If there was a clear commitment that China was not going to go near Taiwan, I think a lot of tensions would reduce. And a lot of the escalation, even around the discomfort between Australia and China, has stemmed from some of these military exercises that have been happening in the Indo-Pacific. So before we go to let's de-escalate all of our tensions, is what is some of the root causes that may not be started by the United States is really important. To your question about recycling, I would say that that's a really important element, and it's actually one that we're just coming to. We've long known how to recycle things like copper, and if you think about 15 years ago, we couldn't get 98% of lithium out of a lithium-ion battery the way we can today. One of the things in the U.S. that we're really focusing our efforts is we're looking at what we don't want to export, what we call our black mass. We don't want to send our goods out to China for them to get those permanent magnets out. So we are warp speeding our capabilities here in the U.S. to be able to recycle things, particularly with permanent magnets, to get that back out.
All right. Thank you very much to all of our guests. Apologies, Henry, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thanks to all of you, to Brian Wong, to Gracelin Baskaran, and to Henry Wang, and thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the entire team here, bye for now.